fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. A lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm with Dr. Engel-Di Mauro, Associate Professor of Geography at SUNY and author of a bunch of books, actually. But the one that we're going to talk about is Socialist States and the Environment, Lessons for Eco-Socialist. And I liked your book because it was a corrective to a lot of myths, some of which I think are based in anti-communism, some of which I think are actually innocent, but do have to kind of be disentangled. So I'm going to let you kind of state the problematic yourself. How do you think the end of the 20th century actually handled the way we understood the USSR and the PRC in regards to environmental failures? I remember being told, for example, that yellow dust when I lived in the Republic of Korea was caused by socialist mismanagement of resources along the Gobi Desert. Turns out that's not entirely true. A lot of it's just smog. But how did these myths come about? Which one of these kind of environmental catastrophes aren't myths, and how did the socialist states maybe mitigate them as a way to kind of get into the problem here?
Right. And thank you for inviting me, and also even for considering reading the book. I'm just hoping that it's helpful to clarify exactly those kinds of matters. There are there's a basis in actually occurring environmentally destructive processes, certainly in socialist countries. Some of them have been exaggerated. There are some complexities to how the assessments have been made and have changed over time. But by the 1990s, when records were being opened more widely, and I choose that word as a comparative because it's not really been the case as it's made out to be. The environmental records or that environmental impacts were hidden from view from the wider public in socialist countries, as it's made to be believed. And this I had to find out, by doing a bit of research on how things were reported, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There are, just like in liberal democracies, certain bits of information that the public is not allowed to even come close to. And I think that by now I've come to the conclusion that it's much worse under liberal democracy than it is in socialist countries, ironically, because, for example, if you're talking about fracking, good luck getting any information. And if you're talking about most things that are under private control, that you have no access to them unless you have someone inside. So there's a lot of mythology about that, and I think the 1990s were sort of well, I guess it depends on where one was in the 1990s in terms of the appraisals. A lot was made, a lot of sensationalization was made out of a World Bank report that sort of gave the impression that the USSR was such an environmental catastrophe that one might have wondered, how is it possible that people are even living in the USSR? There was such incredible sensationalization. But it wasn't the first time. It was already being made of course, after the Chernobyl accident, which certainly occurred. Obviously, it was horrific, but in comparison to what was the context, that was always has been what has been missing in, or not always, but has been a minority sort of perspective in terms of understanding what happened with such disasters. But the problem is that in the 1990s, especially, it was there was everything being reduced to one or two kinds of horrific bouts of environmental destruction. Chernobyl being one example, the Aral Sea being another. And then taking those and reducing all of socialism to those effects, those couple of extreme forms of impacts. And now, what is really curious is that the same was not done for the United States, which has thousands of Superfund sites, and I mean, which is really like we have one disaster zone after another. I used to live in New Jersey. Every square kilometer was a disaster zone, still is. And people are still living there, but there are loads of people with ailments as well. Who knows where they're coming from? But no one is making claims that the United States is like the worst ever perpetrator of environmental destruction in the universe. So that's one thing that was happening in the 90s, and of course with this is extended to the People's Republic of China. It's extended to any remaining socialist country. Curiously enough, Vietnam doesn't get as much publicity about this, but the People's Republic of China, of course, has. And the thing is that in the PRC, at first, sort of there were clumsy attempts to sort of say, no, well, look, I mean, it's not as bad as you think it is, but it was. But there were also self-serving kinds of exaggerations being made in North America, in Western Europe about China that have not really panned out when you get to look into the details. And in fact, some of the people who were involved in analyzing the situation of, say, soil erosion, sort of had to admit that no, actually, we don't have communist soil erosion. That was actually how things were being phrased, like communist soil erosion. So, well, I'm sorry, but I think that the environment is a little wider than it's just the politics of a fraction of humanity, of just one species. It's just that's how things have been treated. And I have to say, the left, particularly in the West, has actively participated in mythology or exaggerations, or I think some, for the most part, in an ingenuous way. Most of the times, you have people who are on the left, including Marxists, who have no clue about how ecosystems work. They really have not studied environmental science, and it shows. And so they'll take these reports as if they were genuine, and as if they were not themselves informed. These reports on the environment were not informed by bourgeois biases, which they are oftentimes. And I've actually found some incredible examples of the data being given, which actually disproves the conclusions in scientific publications. And I thought, come on, I mean, you got to do better than that. At least cook the data, but they didn't even do that. In some, like for example, with deforestation in the USSR, it was claimed that it was increasing over time. In fact, the exact opposite was going on over decades. So when you have reports like that, and made not by environmental scientists, not by ecologists, but by people who are maybe agronomists, economists, that's a lot of what the reports were coming out of, were being made by people who are actually not expert in those fields. And again, I suppose, like, people who would not be able to know one way or another would be, well, I mean, it includes me as well, because I was beginning postgraduate in the 90s. and that was a running theme. It's like, oh, the USSR is much worse than anything that than even the worst impacts that have happened in the West. And there have been many, because where I grew up in Italy, we had Seveso, which is a hallmark in terms of international environmental policy, with respect to there are several kind of policies that came out of that, but it was a huge dioxin release. It was in 1976. So I was a kid, and I was not too far away from that place. And so, like, to be told, that the USSR was much worse and stuff like that, at some point, it's sort of, I believed that for a while as well, because I simply did not look up the data. But then, at the same time, because of that background, and there was also the Vajont disaster in northeast Italy. There were a whole bunch of disasters that I was witnessing in the United States when I was living, my first years in the United States. It was kind of noticeable. So there was always that kind of contrast, that kind of this disjuncture between what I was told and the reality that I was living through, or like that I was hearing about. But yeah, so the assessments were often very ideologically based and not really based on evidence. Then I had the good fortune of going to Hungary and lived there in the early 1990s. And so it's like this story that, it's just socialism leads to environmental disasters. Well, I didn't think that I was living in an environmental disaster where I was living in Hungary. In fact, it was rather very different from New Jersey, because I was going back to New Jersey and then going to Hungary. It's like saying, I think New Jersey's kind of worse off, environmentally speaking, than Hungary does. And it's kind of so there were these contrasts as well, that I wasn't understanding what I was missing. So for a long time, I just was sitting on these data, because I was also studying soils. By the way, that's kind of my background. I was studying soil degradation in Hungary, and I was noticing that there were a lot of things that were just not measuring up to the claims. I'm sorry, I'm going very long, and I'm hoping to have answered at least some of what you were asking.
Yeah, you did. And actually, I want to bring an example from your book to kind of like focus in on the impossibility of comparisons, but also like the dishonesty of a lot of the comparisons. So, for example, in your book, you talk about the Kola Peninsula and deforestation tactics, but then you mentioned that really while you can't excuse Stalin for maintaining some of the Tsarist deforestation, you have to admit that it has a long history and it was just maintained. It was not newly introduced. But then you immediately point out the development of the Cotton Belt. Now, I grew up in Georgia in the southeastern United States, is where I was born. And I remember learning as an adult that the landscape that I actually thought was native to where I grew up was entirely kind of implanted there in the 1920s and 30s, and also really poorly, with massive invasive species not considered, all kinds of soil effects not considered. You can't just put in pines to replace ancient oak trees. You can't, and all that was strip forested for plantation land, for the Cotton Belt. And the ecological devastation in the Southeast is never spoken about that way. It's kind of thinly papered over by like transplant plants and stuff like that. But it really profoundly altered the landscape of the region. And I only realized this, even though I grew up there, as an adult. So so when I hit that part in your book, I was like, oh, I've seen this. Like, not even dealing with the fact that like the Augusta River plant, which is a Superfund site,
right,
is there. That there's all kinds of issues about increased cancer rates in the areas around that site that they've never proven was tied to the storage of nuclear waste. And I don't know even how you would exactly. But there is an increased incidence there, and that in that area is, historically speaking, textile mills, which is poor white workers and a lot of very poor black workers. And today, that area is pretty much just black. The white workers have largely left. So it's, you can see that. I've never heard that really talked about when you talk about ecological devastation, but the same kinds of things are talked about in Russia. Now,
Right.
doesn't make what happened in Russia right, but it's hard to also blame it on socialism when it was just continuing things that were already happening, right? Like,
yes, the Aral Sea is a good example, actually, because there was, the negative impact was certainly preceded. It was already happening. The redirection of water for crops that shouldn't be grown in arid lands was already happening in late 1800s. So, there's also climatological change as well. Matters are rather much more complex oftentimes. One thing that perhaps it might be worthwhile to posit here is that there seems to be a tendency to equate environmental impact with social system. And things are not that simple. Under Stalin, actually, there was a massive the Shelter Belt program. And it's actually lasted for really outlived that administration by a long shot. And it was very positive in terms of what it did, in terms of reducing soil erosion and having greater biodiversity than otherwise would have been the case. But if one says that, then one accused of being a Stalinist or something like that. It's just, no, I'm sorry, but ecological processes are much wider than social ones, and what may last for decades to centuries might outlast the kinds of social systems that existed that impacted the landscape previously. And so this is kind of it's a facile kind of equation that I often see, and that like democracy will somehow magically bring better healthier environments. But I'm sorry, that's not how things will work out most often than not. For example, if we were to have actual democracy in the United States, don't we wish? We're not going to get rid of the lead problem in soils. That's going to last for centuries. And so this kind of strange linkage being made is maybe what's also behind the kinds of for me strange reasoning that occurs in terms of environmental impact. So what that does is that it's not so easy to just pinpoint the blame on one or another system. And this is also to come back to what you were pointing out. So like I would say the difficulty of making comparisons is that as well, because what are we comparing, and how are we going to control for the many interconnections that are out there between societies, within societies, and as well within different parts of societies, different parts of other species, because they evolve and they don't necessarily evolve in unison or in a homogeneous manner. I hope not be complicating things too much, but if we're looking at prairie systems and we're looking at the impacts on groundwater supplies from, let's say, like the past 100 years, it's going to impact what's going to happen in the next maybe 100 years as well. And then add to that global climate change, and then you have an additional spin to that, and you might not have a replenishment of the water supplies, not because of any local impacts, but because of global climate change or regional climate changes that have very little to do with local impacts. So one has to take into consideration multiple scales of analysis and interconnections. And that's actually one of the major flaws that I was finding in a lot of the analyses about the environmental impacts in socialist countries. And again, it's not to say that there were impeccable records, but in fact, what I found, to my astonishment, I have to also add, is that the record was not great, but it actually ends up in several kinds of impacts, especially in terms of atmospheric impacts like carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, and with soil erosion and biodiversity, that actually socialist countries have a better record than the most powerful, wealthiest so-called democracies. And that was actually, I found that, well, not exactly astonishing, but certainly unexpected. But precisely because, it was built up over the decades, where I grew up, and also within the kinds of left movements or organizations where I've been in, there was this kind of running theme that, we have a huge ecological crisis, and yes, we want to have socialism, but not the USSR form of socialism, because that's even worse. And in fact, it's better. That's actually the thing. It's not a great, it's got a lot of problems, but if you look at it in comparison to the United States, Canada, whatever else, actually, it's a better record overall. Overall doesn't mean that we don't have problems, doesn't mean that you don't have disasters. It just means that, well, if you want to at least reduce the destructiveness of a system, we might want to follow and learn from and build on what socialist states were able to achieve. Because they, it's not like they didn't care. It's not like they didn't have like people who were involved in putting a check on industrial production, on mining and things like that. There were always frictions within and between economic departments. You can see this also within the People's Republic of China, if one looks carefully at not at the social science studies, because there are limits to, you can't really apply social theory to the environment. It just doesn't work very well. So you have to look at the environmental data, wherever you can get your hands on it, to really get a better grasp, and then always link it up at multiple scales. So, well, okay, so in China, they're producing stuff and it's creating smog, but why are they producing that stuff there? Is it just, because they just want to like make profits? And then you find out, well, no, actually part of that is because they become the manufacturer for the rest of the world. So it would be like, I don't know, blaming Brazil for deforestation without looking at where the timber goes. And that's not very useful. If one really is interested in trying to resolve environmental impacts, it's not very useful to just focus on countries as if they were like isolated units. Anyway.
Well, one of the arguments I think your book pretty convincingly makes is both European and post-European settler societies tend to outsource their environmental degradation. I mean, that was kind of made explicit in the last 3 years with the green milestones being met by Russian gas production, but in Europe, but in the US, it's also explicit in some ways internally, because it's very liberals talk about this as environmental justice, but it is very much like classed and racialized where these Superfund sites are, how people get stuck near them, the neighborhoods that they affect. What I found interesting about your book that I didn't really know, because I pretty much knew eco-socialism from the John Bellamy Foster narrative, of which there was this new left eco-socialism in the West that was completely disconnected from the USSR and also totally critical of bad old Promethean Marx. Then there was the metabolic rift people, and then there's the post-metabolic rift people. That's kind of the narrative. And which is not to say that John Bellamy Foster has a problem with what actually happens in socialist states. I think he's become more outspoken defending elements of what China does, but it does kind of shut out this entire development in the USSR and in the PRC. And I did not know, for example, that there was a conservation element to the pro-cult movement. I didn't know that even during the height of, a civil war, the Red Terror, and everything else in 1919, there was actually an environmental conservation movement starting with water and moving out from there, almost contemporaneously to the U.S.'s conservation movement. But the U.S.'s conservation movement was mostly, if we're frank, aesthetic. It was not,
That's a good point. Yeah.
So it's like that, realizing that reading your book, I just wanted to go in. What did you learn about, like, say, Soviet and PRC environmental policy even early on? Like,
that I have to thank some people I got to know over the years. One of them is Aaron Gare in Australia, and he did some nice work on exactly on the early Bolshevik conservationism. Although I depart from him now, I guess, or eventually I have, because I was looking at the evidence after Lenin's leadership, and it did not pan out that it was, as Aaron had put it, that there was a road not taken. In fact, they continued to take the road, and it faltered. It went in different directions, but one can't say that it ended with the purges, which was also what John Bonamy Foster thought at first. And then he also went and did some more digging up, and he also discovered that it wasn't that simple. And I also have to thank someone who is certainly a very much an apologist for liberalism, and that is Douglas Weiner, who is a wonderful historian, very meticulous, and it's thanks to him also that a lot of this stuff has become more widely known to people who are not versed with the archives from the USSR or can't read Russian. So now there are many sources, I guess, drawing from, and I was reading, and the more I was reading, it's like, oh, okay. Even like the older folks in the 1970s, like Marshall and Goldman, there were treasure troves of in terms of their studies on environmental impact in the USSR that actually went exactly against what then becomes in vogue in the 1990s. They were showing exactly the opposite of what was being claimed by the 1990s. So there was this contrast as well that I was drawing from. With the People's Republic of China, it's a little bit more difficult for me because my Chinese is just virtually non-existent. So it's really difficult to get to the data, and some of those are not disclosed to the public as well, like at least foreign public. And I think for good reason, frankly, because there's one thing that I suppose I should add is that we're dealing with countries that are constantly under siege, from without, and you have contradictions within. So, in that kind of situation, it's just, it might be asking a bit much, to say, oh, I'm coming from Italy or from the United States, open up the vaults for me so that I can give you a bad reputation. It's like, well, screw off, it should be the answer, obviously. But nevertheless, there are plenty of studies that have happened that examine the situation from the 30s onwards, and that show rather much more constructive relations to the rest of nature than it has been made out to be, and also intellectual currents that parts of them were marginalized, but parts of them were not entirely marginalized, and actually were aided and abetted by more regional powers within the USSR. You had, patronage from maybe commissars, in different republics. So these things, complicate the story quite a bit, and of course, then you have different kinds of outcomes. Let's see. One thing that I wanted to also make sure to bring up is that unfortunately, the attention with respect to environmentalists of socialist countries is kind of reduced to the USSR and Eastern Europe for the most part, and then people forget about Mongolia, forget about Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. I mean, there are quite a few socialist countries, or now they're no longer socialist countries, but they do have environmental records, and we might want to look at those as well. It's kind of a shame. So I've been trying. I mean, in that book, I was just beginning to do it. I've been trying to actually look at the situation, how it developed in Mongolia, and it's looking like something similar is afoot in terms of exaggerations being made, and actually the environmental record certainly not being spotless, but certainly being much better than it is now, especially since the 1990s. It really has become Mongolia has been turned into basically a gigantic mining concern. It's really sad, and people who are trying to fight against it are being put in jail, and this is under democracy apparently. And so it's like, okay, so under this so-called terrible dictatorial regime, you've got actually a better track record for the environment, and of course also a better track record in terms of people's standards of living, which is the other part of the story that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about as well. Because but actually I wanted to return to that, if that's okay, because what you mentioned is such an important the point you made is so important with respect to the outsourcing, basically the neocolonialism required to have lavish lifestyles, at least for a minority, in the so-called democracies, right? So the USSR, I guess I'll get into trouble, but it was not exactly a colonial power. You didn't have like the USSR being present, in Africa and like extracting, resources, like Britain or France. You don't have China doing that either, really, although people might want to claim that. But if you look at the record so far, there's not much showing. There are some problems here and there, but I mean, if you compare to the imperialist systems that still are, the European Union, whatever else, they're really riding on other people's environments. And of course, in North America, as we well know, Canada, Australia as well, New Zealand, they're US, they're built on extracting resources, taking away resources, but also ransacking environments that were lived in by Native American peoples. So, if that's not colonialism. In the USSR, on the other hand, for better or worse, there are problems with some policies as well, and some of them were disastrous, absolutely. So I don't want to belittle that. You have cases of millions of deaths, but then again, you also have cases of millions of deaths in other countries, and we don't stick it to socialism. You have the problem of trying to improve people's standards of living while being under constant military threat, sanctions, economic sabotage from within and without, and also not having colonies to exploit to get the resources, kind of like like the Netherlands effect, like where you have nice greenery and all that sort of stuff, and its basis is basically destruction of Indonesia and and Suriname or whatever else, right? And but the Netherlands look really good, don't they? You don't have that option in socialist countries, because they don't go out and ransack the rest of the world in order to put up their infrastructure and increase people's standards of living with that, even though it's not even necessarily what they're trying to do, which is really just profit making. But anyway, sorry, I went a little bit too long.
No. I mean, I think one of the things you have to deal with, particularly with the U.S., is just the nested layers of colonialism. Like,
yes,
like one of the things that made me more sympathetic to world systems theory, which I saw you used in your book for some of your analysis, but particularly Wallerstein's, is also looking at the way Wallerstein, like, you apply that to the core and periphery to the world, but you also have to imply it within the U.S. itself. So you can see the way, like, parts of the Black Belt in the industrial Midwest are the way they are. You can see how it affects racialized communities, also poor white communities. You can see how it you can also see how it leads to weird backlash and petty bourgeoisification and all kinds of things once you do that. And no one ever does that. I mean, like, no one ever makes it like when I say no one ever does that, people don't look at, like, for example, flows of goods within, say, the Warsaw Pact, or like when talking about imperialism in the USSR, they don't look at, for example, and this is not to defend or condemn what the Soviets did in Afghanistan, actually, but like, that was not, if you know the stats, you know that it was not a purely extractive engagement. Which is not to say the Soviets never engaged in extractive engagements with certain, communities, but I tend to, I don't think they did a great job in Azerbaijan, but in general, you just see so much less of it. Whereas, like, in the West, you have two problems. You have one problem with the colonial, neocolonial consumption, and both internal and external. But I think you also have the fact that we have no profit incentive to ever build anything that is going to last, because dead labor is a profitability problem. Like,
that's a good way of putting it.
So, one thing, I was talking to someone about growth or degrowth, and I was like, I don't love this entire framework, because if we're building stuff to last so that like prior investment is not a liability to future profitability, the entire arrangement looks different. Like, you're not concerned about GDP growth, which is dependent on basically manufacturing stuff even when you don't need it. Like, and in so much that you see socialist states do that, it is kind of them necessarily trying to integrate with the global community to get goods that they're otherwise shut out of. Like, and I'm not saying, that that's always the best thing to do, but I also don't know what the options are. I mean, if you look at, what China was looking at in, say, 1976, I can be pretty pissed off about the Sino-Soviet split, but I can't really.
Me too.
But I can't really be mad about them having to develop some kind of industrial productive base and try to use that as a way to get over the, quote, middle income trap, without going and scourging other countries for it.
Exactly.
And so it just seems like you're comparing apples to, like, kumquats. It's just not. It's not even like, they're both fruit, kind of, but that's all you're really sharing. Like,
the intentions are the sources of legitimacy for the systems are really entirely different, and that should not be lost. Should not be underestimated either. I mean, if you have a revolution and it's a socialist revolution and you're going to keep it socialist, you've got to at least show the goods, or else you're going to get ousted with another revolution or counter-revolution, I should suspect. I mean, it takes a lot of trouble and a lot of resources, especially in a country that does not have the luxury of ransacking the rest of the world to run an army and to build weapons, to keep a population down. So I don't know. It's just one of the things that I find interesting sometimes as well is people sort of, on the one hand, it could be the same people sometimes as well, sort of saying, oh yeah, well, the USSR was just an economic disaster, stuff like that, and it was an environmental disaster, and then you look at the data, and so on the one hand, they're complaining about GDP being too low, and then on the other hand, they're also complaining about environmental disasters. Like, well, sorry, mates, but the two things are related. Maybe you can think about how efficient the GDP was relative to environmental, impact. But even so, it's kind of strange that people would, at the same time, talk at both ends of their mouths, as it were. Having, oh, look, there's a growth problem with socialist countries, and on the other hand, oh, look, they're environmentally devastating. To go back to the growth and degrowth stuff, I'm sympathetic to the degrowthers, I have to say, even though I've critiqued them harshly as well, in particular one person, but who probably wants to kill me. But yeah, well, but it does. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I mean, I should have written stuff in a much more diplomatic way, but it would have been the same, I think, in the end. But it's just that it has to be put in context. Just like you were saying, you need to grow the infrastructure in order to have the ability to have people who can be fed, clothed, and housed. There are some destructive aspects to it. Now, one debate that I guess I've entered into, and it's not resolvable or resolved by any means, and I have no idea how it could be resolvable, is that in order to achieve socialism, let's say, like, let me just put it another way. In order to have the working classes have a standard of living that is not, like much of the world, let's say, in which you basically have not reliable running water, it may not be potable, electricity supplies are not reliable if you have any. If you want to get people to have the standard of living that a minority of working class right now enjoys, and I say that with quotes, enjoys, because it's always contingent, and we know that there are a couple of million people who go hungry every day in the United States, for example. But let's say you want to have the majority of people finally not be dirt poor and having a better life in terms of material conditions, and where are the materials going to come from, right? So how are we going to achieve that? And how is it going to be possible if we're going to be in some respects destroying at least parts of the environment to do that? And it could be temporary, and then the question would be, okay, which places are going to be destroyed, and who's going to be benefiting, and how, and make sure that everybody benefits from this destructive aspect that the aim is for it to be temporary. It's not an easy set of questions to resolve. And I've yet to see, people who talk growth or degrowth or eco-socialists as well, like come up with, okay, some sort of strategy, economic, political, and environmental, all at once, that would take care of getting the majority of people to not suffer, to live, long enough, at least, that compared to now, much longer, and in better health, and achieve that without having any environmental impact. I think it's impossible, frankly. And so I'm getting also sometimes perplexed about people who talk about sacrifice zones without, as a general thing, without putting into context. It's like, yeah, I mean, they're right about the sacrifice zones. I mean, just to fixate on the sacrifice zone aspect without looking at what the solutions could be. And why are those sacrifice zones wrong? We have other sacrifice zones that have been made, but actually the people who are writing about sacrifice zones are enjoying the benefits of those sacrifice zones. And so it's kind of strange, it gets a little contorted and contradictory and maybe uncomfortable to speak about. But I do environmental science work, and so it's kind of in my face all the time. And so I think that it'd probably be worthwhile to have at least an open dialogue about it without fixations, without purism. That's it. That's what I want to really say. Without this kind of purism in which, we're going to achieve socialism and a squeaky clean environment at the same time, while having to parry, nuclear-armed foes. I was just, what universe are you from would be the question if one, sort of thinks that that's easily resolvable. Anyway,
I I think one of the questions that emerges to me when I think about growth and degrowth, one of the points that degree growthers make that I kind of agree with, is we do have to radically address and rethink uneven development, and we cannot just say like, there will be no trade-offs for the developed world. If we believe in basic Marxist principles like abolition of town and country, not that we can do that immediately, no one thinks that, but like we also have to admit that that means radically rethinking our relationship to the priorly developing, in quotation marks, world, or the underdeveloped world, or the overexploited world. I think all those could possibly be simultaneously true. And that will involve trade-offs. I do think in some ways that puts an onus on leftists in the developed world to both develop an actual policy for this, that does not totally make their politics unviable domestically, but does attempt to admit that like we might all get good things, we might not all get bananas.
Yes.
And that may actually involve sometimes globalizing food chains, sometimes it'll involve relocalizing them. But the more of the world that has input into that, I think the better the decisions are going to be. Right now, it's not even that all the developed world gets a say in that. It's basically our elite classes that get the say in that, really. Like when we talk about like socialist effects on environmental policy, it's like socialist effects on geopolitics. It's like, okay, I'm in the DSA, I can write my electeds, I guess, and if they don't just blacklist me immediately, I might have some downstream effects, but I have to be honest about the promises. Okay, one of the things I get very frustrated with, kind of current views of American socialism, for example, is not admitting that there's a reason why you can't get social democrats to vote against the military dollar, to give it to, now even the way I phrase that betrays my bias, but to give it to like internal developmental like programs like schools, wealth equalization programs with disadvantage. The reason why that can't happen is also if you do that, the dollar is a lot less valuable globally. There's just no way around that. And so, modern monetary theory is true, but it's true on the back of something very nasty.
Yeah, well put. Exactly. Yeah.
So same too with the environment. And so like we do kind of have to be honest about that and not say that we can sugar rock candy mountain everything, nor should we, I don't know, do what I think was some of the response to this stuff in the 1990s amongst certain kinds of leftists. I don't think these people are as popular now as they were when I was 20, but
which ones are you thinking about?
Oh, I'm thinking about primitivists and people who, and people who just go, we have to let 99% of the population die off, which, and I always point out that, yeah, you say that when you live in like the Pacific Northwest, where you can foreseeably, like, I don't know, pretend to be a hunter-gatherer, but like nobody else can do that. Like, it's not a viable survival mechanism, which you've already admitted. And then you also ignore the fact that that's going to play out in very racialized and classized ways, in which, quite frankly, if you think this through, you're not likely to be the person to survive. The capitalist is. So, like, I don't know how you think this is going to end. Now, that politics is really easy to debunk, I think, but it seems like, and most people know that in its most extreme 1990s primitivist form, but I think it does. I think actually, and this is part of the problems with the growth degrowth, bright green versus whatever debates, is there's a tendency to link elements of degrowth to that kind of tradition. And frankly, there are some degrowthers who are that.
Yeah. Aggressively, yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the other things I don't like about the degrowth is I'm like, well, I can think of at least 5 different things that actually is, and they're not in agreement with one another.
Yeah.
Like Kohei Sato and Half Earth Socialism.
Yeah.
And
Troy de Tese, yeah.
Yeah, they're not saying the same things. Like,
no, yeah.
But I do think we are going to have to admit that we're not going to be able to sustain even a declining world population, which, you know, I think is going to, I think is thanks to urbanization and some other things is going to decline naturally. Without mass death, although it looks like mass death may be on the horizon anyway.
Oh, I hope not.
But I'm knocking on wood, but lately I haven't felt good about it. It's but I think one thing your book is also a good corrective to is this kind of super bright green, let's say luxury space communism, to use the bad, you know. Yeah, I can see you already like heart. I can see your heart pounding. I'm sorry, but that just doesn't think that socialists are going to have to make trade-offs if we just, I guess, develop the productive forces enough. But I don't know how you do that without making trade-offs. And I also think we could develop the productive forces more responsibly. Definitely.
Yeah.
But you still have to extract energy from the planet. Like there's no real way around that. So, and right now, the one thing I can tell you is that while there is a capitalist green transition kind of sort of on the way, not really, it seems like that is also being used as a way to further neoliberalize or post neoliberalize. Even at this point, I'm not even sure we're dealing with neoliberalism anymore. And I mean that somewhat seriously, but
no, I'm also sort of trying to understand where we're at, and I'm not sure either.
Right.
To call it neoliberalism, it's a different, it's morphing into a different kind of capitalism, but I'm not sure what it is.
Right. Yeah, and I but whatever it is, it seems like there's a very sort of like, well, if you look at, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which has this big green program in it, there is no attempt other than raising a federal contractor minimum wage to make the green energy industry not shitty. And if people know working conditions in that industry, actually, they do not compare to like, say, even UAW workers standards. It's a very neoliberalized, piecemeal, petty bourgeois industry. And in some ways, they are doing a good job at making sure that the environmental movement and the labor movement in the developed world even don't catch up, and definitely don't look at what's going on in state socialist societies. It's just not that's got to be left off the table. Like,
yeah, I mean the town planning that used to exist in the USSR, for example, quite a lot of it will certainly reduce a lot of energy use. Some of it is still, you know, standing in Russia, and it does have a long-term, relatively positive impact. The reduction of the production of rubbish, which was one of the hallmarks of a lot of socialist countries, and before they were made to become liberal democracies, and then he's got this spiral of like incredible amounts of unnecessary packaging and all sorts of stuff, things that are made that are obsolete the next day or the next year, they should have been lifelong possessions to use in the kitchen, for example. So many things could be done, learning from what was achieved in those countries. Some of the achievements would have to do with being under siege. Like in Cuba, making huge, incredible strides, but it is also in some respects shaped by the now more than 60-year embargo. But nevertheless, I mean, one of the things that Cuba showed is that if you look at countries under an embargo like that, well, either they would have caved in and just become the latest US subordinated gangster show, which basically was Cuba before the Cuban Revolution, or take the neoliberal road. Why not? And solve the rest of society. But they haven't done that thanks to having actual socialists in power. So, in some respects, in the US, this is pie in the sky. But why not? If we, I don't know about like seizing the state or something like that. But if we did have, let me premise that if we had any socialists who gained any sort of influence or even near getting any social influence, it's an automatic assassination or series of assassinations. So we should face that fact, I think. I mean, it didn't take very much. Malcolm X was nowhere near, or like Huey P. Newton, they were nowhere near like gaining any sort of power that really would have put into question the entirety of the system. That and yet they were assassinated. Just so many people who if they had even just a fraction of the power that the Bidens and Kennedys of the world have, or the Bushes, they would have had an incredible positive impact on the US and the rest of the world. But I think that's what we have to deal with in the United States, and that's another thing that I think needs to be put on the table for discussion. Is that, well, you can get your representatives in Congress, but you can get some sort of palliative measures introduced, which is fine. I think it's well worthwhile. But the problem is that you have an entire a ruling class that really needs to be, frankly, how do I put this in a way that doesn't sound, they need to be put down. They need to be got rid of. Or I mean, not necessarily in terms of like being killed, it's just in terms of having them do something useful, like scrubbing toilets, being cooks.
Yeah.
But how do you achieve that? If in a situation in which even like you have some sort of radicalization on the street that's calling for just even minor reforms, you get beaten up. It's kind of difficult. So yeah, I mean, but at least we could draw from all these very rich histories of and achievements that were made in all these socialist countries and continue to be made, and also learn from the mistakes and learn from things that didn't go so well. But in order to be able to get to that point, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just in order to get to that point, you have to have political power. You have to have a level of influence in US society that enables those kinds of policies to be not just put into place, but to be permanently a feature of society. And that is something that is quite much more difficult, and there needs to be much more organizing and coordination than at present we have in any leftist formation. But historically, it's never really been there anyway. So
not in the U.S. I mean,
no, unfortunately, yeah.
There was a brief moment, kind of in like 1915, and then again in like 1939. But unfortunately, well, I won't go into how I think third period was terrible for Europe, but actually good for the U.S. But that's a very unpopular position that I have. the U.S. gas is particularly difficult because even socialist strategy, as we understand it, going all the way back to the Second International, is based on parliamentary system,
Yeah.
which we don't have.
That's true. Yeah.
So like when we talk about popular fronts versus united fronts, I'm like, I don't even know what that means in the U.S. context, really. Like I don't love the popular front, the way the popular front works out in the U.S., but I also don't really know what other options we ever had. And and when I think about it, I think it's actually a harder road to hoe. The other thing that I was going to say though is like even the Second International before the 1920s admitted that if they got an electoral road to socialism, it was almost always going to lead to at least a minor civil war. There was no way, around that. They were hoping it was going to be minor. Like that was the best you were going to get.
Yeah.
And I remember Engels promising in that time, in the 1880s, like, we realized this. We're just hoping, we think the capitalists are a small group and we'll be able to contain them fairly quickly, and then you won't need repressive apparatuses nearly to that extent very long. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, including all these intermediary classes that keep getting in the way.
That's true. That's very complicated. Yeah.
It seems like that optimism has to be tempered somewhat. And yet I one of the things that I'm really big on right now, regardless of how you feel about the particularities of the current PRC, for the survival of the fucking planet, you need normalization of relations between the US and the PRC to some degree. There's no, like, that should be something every socialist.
Oh, that's a must. Absolutely.
Yeah. Every socialist, regardless of even how you feel about the PRC, has to just say, like, we have to take a stance on normalization, at least to the best of our ability, with the People's Republic of China, because without that, for both eco-socialist and for geopolitics, we're going to live in a multipolar world. I don't think that inherently is good or bad. I just think it's an inevitability.
Yeah, me too.
So how that looks is going to largely depend on whether or not you can at least have detente between what are obviously going to be the great regional powers, and there will be no global hegemon anymore. The transatlantic superstate isn't powerful enough to do that. NATO can't rule the planet anymore. I think even NATO knows that. I'm not sure though. Well, you see, I actually, my dark thought is maybe they do know that, and they're just willing to fuck everything up on the way down. Like,
yeah, that's my fear as well. It's like, we're just gonna go to another planet. Well, they don't have one, fortunately. So at least they can't think that they can get away with a nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean, we still have MAD, which sadly, the amount of human survival that is weirdly dependent on our ability to completely kill ourselves is kind of disheartening, because I do think that's the only reason why the capitalist world gloves are even kind of off. I think we'd see a lot more than just proxy wars if that was not the case.
Yeah, I think you're right. But a minimum program in terms of foreign policy I think that's something worth fighting for in the US context. You have, of course, in terms of internal dynamics, I mean, we're in a settler colonial regime, and that makes it very, very tough. I mean, when you have certain segments of the population who are given privileges, maybe they're just crumbs, but still privileges relative to other, and that makes it difficult to get coordinated across, the working class spectra. That's another big challenge. And that was also something that in the USSR they were trying to overcome, because of all the nationalities conflicts. And it didn't exactly work out either. But there were putting a lid on it much more effectively. And here instead, it's like they want to keep increasing the tensions rather than the opposite. It's like, so like organizing the workplace, as you well know, it makes for some challenges there as well. Because
oh yeah, racially, genderly, even like even class habitasly, like organizing people who come from, even though we're all we're all a certain kind of. I'm a teacher, so I would say I'm a non-productive labor aristocratic worker in the old sense of that term. I don't say that as a moral judgment or to say that we aren't part of the broader whatever, but we aren't. We don't produce surplus for capital, and that's not a moral judgment; it's a fact. And so our incentive structure is a little strange. We also aren't so a labor aristocratic that say we make more than our raises go higher than inflation. So we're kind of a weird bunch. But even in that, like rural urban divides, I live in Utah. Rural unions are actually overrepresented in the state level union councils because of everything from the cost of joining the union in rural areas is cheaper to there's just more schools. I mean, the overhead costs are different. I should be somewhat careful about this, but there's not that much national or even state level incentive to deal with this because the unions own a lot of buildings, and so like they're not even that concerned about dues. There's all kinds of problems there. However, the two things I think we have to look at and as a minimum program in the United States is a rebirth of a multi-class workers union, some kind of amelioration of historically wronged oppressed peoples within the context of recognizing, how do I say this? I don't mean in the full Jay Sakai way.
Understood.
But I do think we have to like deal with the contradictions, and it would even. I often think about, okay, well, what would a nation's policy look like in the U.S.? And I'm like, I don't even know how that works. But we do have to somehow deal with these real and earned lack of trust that's even built into stuff like the U.S. wealth gap. Like, the U.S. wealth gap is totally explainable between races, basically by property ownership. Like you can explain, you just like. How did 2007 to 2010 play out for one group versus the other? And it literally explains almost the entirety of the wealth gap. That's fixable, but until you do fix it, that's a real antagonism between people and totally changes their incentive structure. Like,
and it would have quite a bit of environmental implications as well.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I remember before I was even a Marxist, I think this was around 2004, and this was when I noticed collateralized debt. I kind of got onto that pretty early. And just going and seeing how people were turning pasture land and semi-renewed forest in like the Southeast into investment homes for nobody.
Yes, I've seen the photos. They're incredible. I used to show that in my class, actually, from Georgia. When I used to teach in Wisconsin, it's like, wow, look at this sprawl. And like, how do you explain this sprawl? It's obviously not for people to live in. So, and it has a huge environmental impact. So how do we explain this? Obviously, it's not because of like population growth. There's something growing, but it's not it's not people inhabiting those houses. So I mean, those phenomena,
well, in Georgia, except for Atlanta and Savannah, you literally saw all the urban centers actually fall out of nothing. Like they just started to decay. They've lost population. You have the decline. You have the kind of stark choice of gentrification or die. Like, and in a lot of places in the South, particularly in the Black Belt parts of the South where I'm from. The or die was actually the part that was selected. They weren't gentrified; they were just allowed to rot. And and honestly, one frustration I have in socialist discourse, even in terms of the environment, actually, is us not looking at the South was never completely industrialized anyway, but like the deindustrial South, the actual deindustrial Midwest. There's a reason, for example, that Black Lives Matter starts in St. Louis. And yes, it may end in Seattle or New York. That's a whole different problem. But like, there's a reason why it starts in St. Louis. And that reason is political economic. And it also, if you look at the environment in those areas, the environment shows it.
Yes.
Like, you can't separate these things out. Like,
exactly. Yeah, it's one of those occasions where there's quite a bit of overlap. Absolutely. Yeah, it's impossible for that not to happen, it seems. Also because, I mean, these economic processes, these racialized, caste and gendered policies really are basically, as you know, it's like the siting of the pollution centers or the the rubbish heaps or whatever, are very much a function of racialized community location. But in other situations elsewhere in the world, it's not as clear cut as you see it in the US. Not to say that it doesn't exist, but here it's particularly. I mean, so that's why environmental justice is so important. I guess it's why it came out of the United States.
It is interesting to think about when we also talk about comparisons between the quote socialist world and the capitalist world. I have, for years, I taught abroad. I was basically a servant of the globalized petite bourgeoisie, unfortunately. But
you gotta make a living.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do. It's also useful for understanding the classes, actually. And I think one thing I would critique American socialists for is they actually don't tend to understand, but like a pretty narrow strata of the American class complex, which is kind of like downwardly mobile, upper middle class people. But the what I saw in the, once I left Korea and I lived in northern Mexico, which was triply devastated, including by the Zeta Sinaloa cartel war. Thank you, Fort Benning. And then I was in Egypt during the end of the counter-revolution. That was also I kind of was like at epicenters of reaction, frankly. But what I saw there in terms of the environment was we don't even have a way to discuss the environmental impact in a lot of these places. For example, I've been to Mexico City. Okay, the air there was not as bad as I heard it was in the 90s. Actually, it was getting a lot better. And I've been to Beijing. The air there was pretty bad. I'm not going to lie, but it actually was not as bad as Egypt. But Cairo is never in the discussion because no one is measuring the pollution levels. Like when I will hear that, like, I live in Salt Lake City, which some days has as bad of air pollution because of mountain inversion effects as Beijing. There are days where that it's just as bad here as anything I saw in Beijing. But it's never as bad here as some of the worst seasons in Egypt. And that's not even seemingly measured. Like, I lived in Torreon, Mexico. I told you I lived more in Mexico. I don't know that anyone has any idea the air quality there. The water quality is not even from pollution or a lack of sanitation. That's all greatly exaggerated by Western, gringo chauvinists. I guess we should not say Western. But it's not like Mexico isn't part of the West. But whatever the fuck that means. But the water had been dilapidated for industry, for the dairy industry, mostly going to the U.S. actually, to the point that the lagoon region that I was living in was not a lagoon anymore. It was mostly an arsenic pit, and the poor, you would meet a lot of poor people who had splotches on their skin.
Oh no!
You know, from non-terminal levels of arsenic poisoning.
Right.
And you know, that's why you didn't drink the water. It wasn't because it was unsanitary. It was because the water had mostly been used for the cattle industry, and humans were being given slag. And if you could afford it, you could just have clean water delivered to your house. But it was a class good, you know, that yes, as an American, I could afford. But it was something to notice. And then when I started like thinking about the comparison between, oh, well, Beijing's so polluted. And I'm like, well, okay, it's not great. Not going to lie.
Yeah.
But there's all these places in the capitalist developing or semi-developed world, wherever you want to call a place like Mexico, that we're not even keeping track of the environmental damage in a real way. And that was definitely true in North Africa. I mean, it's just, so when I see the stats, I'm always like, I don't know what that means, because there's whole parts of the world we're not comparing, that we're outsourcing this to, and no one is paying attention to it.
Yeah, in fact, that reminds me of the other aspect of environmental impact, which is about monitoring programs. One of the things that caught my attention when I was living in Hungary and doing my field work for the dissertation, but also among other things. But what caught my eye was that in the county that I was doing the work, I was looking at soil acidification, the process of that for the most part. There had been something like 20 soil monitoring stations in that one county, which is like probably not larger than Brooklyn, probably in size. 20 soil monitoring stations by the 90s. So I saw the records, others would not have known. They dwindled to 8 after 1989. In a couple of years, the state funds were cut, and the monitoring program was even semi-privatized. People had to spend money for the first time, like farmers would have to spend money to get information about their soils, and agronomy services were not provided for anymore. It's a disaster. And so yeah, I didn't know about Egypt. I am Beijing. I breathed that air a couple of times, like in 2015. Then when I was back again in 2018, the air was clear. It's like, how the fuck they do that? A lot of state intervention. That's what it.
Yeah, for sure. I will say, when I was in Beijing, it was like 2013, and I have heard from people who live there that things are better now.
Yeah.
So it's.
And in Delhi, in India, it's one of the worst smog in the world, and also where I'm from, in the Po Valley. Like, fortunately, I was from the mountains or near the mountains, so I never really was affected directly. But the level of smog is off the charts. Every year they break the record, like for how many days they've gone with PM10s or PM5s or 2.5, over the limit. But they have the monitoring to do it, fortunately, thanks to a lot of, I guess, and now less and less, state funds going to that. But it takes, the other thing I wanted to mention is that it takes, for that infrastructure, for the monitoring infrastructure to not only to be present, but also to be workable. I mean, the labs and, the analyses, the people who, specialists and stuff like that. It takes quite a few resources to do that too. And how are you going to do that without having some environmental impact? I mean, even the monitoring program itself, with all the reagents that are necessary to do the analyses, the machinery, the energy use, that's something else that oftentimes sort of does not seem to enter the picture in a lot of, even the most mindful eco-socialists or socialists with respect to environmental impact. And it's like, well, got to think about these things too. And they're not minor impacts either. If you can multiply by thousands, monetary stations that you would need in order to even understand whether what is going on is leading us in the right direction. So that's another bit, and that's what the USSR were doing. It wasn't just the USSR, but one of the funny things is that I remember reading is that the USSR didn't have an environmental ministry until really late. Well, they didn't need one. Each compartment, economic department, was actually responsible for having their monitoring program in the environment. Now, whether that worked or not, depended a lot on power relations, petty behavior, like with anything really. It doesn't. I don't think that's going to change necessarily. Whether you have a more democratic system or not, you're going to have these kinds of difficulties at that scale. But still, they had it already integrated, all of that. They didn't need an environmental ministry. When they got an environmental ministry, it was more like, okay, let's coordinate everything that we already did before, which I think was more a greater an improvement, frankly, as well. But at the same time, it's like you want, in order to achieve that, however, you have to put a lot more resources into the trading, monitoring, and running the entire system to monitor at levels that we cannot even imagine in the United States. In Hungary, for example, just the soil monitoring program had if I remember correctly, had a scale of analysis down to 6 hectares. It's like I don't know of other countries that achieved that. They were able to spot problems as a result of that and actually act on them in ways that in most countries you just simply have no chance of being able to do. So those are other things that one could learn. But first we have to get power.
Yeah. That's power in a nuclear armed state with the largest military apparatus that's ever existed in human history.
Redirecting even like a fraction of that would be very helpful in terms of having a lot more people better off, because that's one way. It's like, because you were talking earlier about how do you with the degrowth, how are you going to get politically anywhere with that kind of talk? Well, or maybe it wouldn't be degrowth. It could be the same policy, just run it under a different slogan, depending on the context. That's what I would say. But and then achieve the same thing. It's like, why shouldn't everybody have the right to a composting toilet, for example? It should be part of federal spending. Everybody a composting toilet, a roof that works, that doesn't leak, and it's long lasting, and it's guaranteed also, and it's got the highest LEED, like the construction material and the housing that has the highest LEED level. Those things are actually achievable. They're eminently achievable. We have the technologies, the techniques, the technicians, the skilled. We could have even more skilled workers, or even relatively unskilled workers being employed gainfully in those kinds of activities. Just like half the military budget. I think that would be already. It's like, instead of killing people, getting killed, wouldn't it be nice if you had a proper house? Wouldn't it be nice if you had if you didn't have to worry about where your rubbish goes, and that you don't have to worry about toilets clogging all the time. I'm talking about toilets, but just because sometimes it can be useful. I don't know, because people don't think about it, but it's like you don't have to worry about clogging toilets. You got your composting toilet, and then you can actually sell the compost and make some money on the side. Damn, I can shit and make money too. Damn it. That's what about national healthcare? That's achievable very easily. We have top-notch potential healthcare system as nowhere in the world, and yet we have all these people suffering for no reason. This kind of stuff should be no-brainers, right?
Yeah, that one's even that one's That one's a tough one because it's just like, look, even the other capitalist societies realized that this was more efficient. I don't know what your problem is. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Like, we spend more money with the worst outcomes of the OECD nation that like it's ridiculous. And like and
yeah, so combining degrowth with better health.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the thing about Cuba is Cuba is a proof positive of a lot of things. One of which it is proof positive of is you can actually do a whole lot with preventative programs if they're incentivized. Because that's part of why Cuban doctors are so awesome, is because they focus on that. It was out of necessity originally, but they focus on that. And it works. So it's, you know, there's a whole lot where I just point out to people, I'm like, we could be saving. I mean, even like as a socialist, I don't actually care about saving money, but you know, just as this transitional thing, I'm like, you could save so much just money at all levels of society by doing what is effectively even a capitalist reform. That we won't even do that because I really suspect it's about class power, honestly, because the Fordist compromise system that we have that got neoliberalized, it really empowers employers, even after Obama cares reforms.
The careless system, Obama careless.
We're gonna just put the mandate on workers, put the cost on workers, only take care of the very poor, but at the expense of actually a good portion of the population, and call that successful healthcare reform.
I know, it's tragic. It's sad.
Yeah,
it's like a bad joke on us.
Yeah, it really was. Anyway, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I will definitely tell people they should check out your Social Estates in the Environment from Pluto Press. It came out a few years ago now. What, like, was it 2019? Am I, or
no,
is that
actually,
wrong?
2 years ago, fortunately. It's not that old yet.
2021. All right. Time is weird for me. I'm getting old.
No, I understand that. If I hadn't written the book, I wouldn't know myself.
And you have any other work you think people should check out?
I don't know, if people are interested in urban agriculture, I co-authored a book with a friend of mine, George Martin, and it takes a look at the potentials and the pitfalls of urban food production, or the difficulties and challenges, and how it can be related to eco-socialism. And there's also, that's one of my, I guess, favorite things to do, is an application of historical and dialectical materialism into urban ecosystem functions with urban gardening. So if that's of interest, there's a handbook on eco-socialism that I co-edited with my friends Lee Brownhill and Michelle Levy and Teresa Turner and Taryn Giacomini. That might be useful for people who are into eco-socialism. You get a compendium. John Bentley Foster actually contributed with Brett Clark in that volume as well. If people can't afford that stuff, just write to me. I'll resolve the issue digitally.
That is appreciative of an academic putting their copyright where their politics are, but
it's the least I could do.
So yeah, I actually am very interested in what weirdly actually is often considered formerly an ultra left topic, because unfortunately the only people who really did a whole lot of work in it were Maoist and or Bortegist, weirdly, but which was the urban agriculture and the evening out of town and country,
Yes, that's right.
which I do think is a real problem for liberals and for socialists in a way that like kind of sneaks up on us a lot, because we do tend to just ignore that, like, well, yes, we are at a point finally where there are a majority of the world's population in cities, but you still gotta have the people who produce food on your side, or they're gonna make things real hard.
Yeah, didn't the Bolsheviks learn that lesson?
Right. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, like, I was like, the Chinese did learn something from Bolshevik screw ups, and that was like, you do kind of have to like keep the peasantry and the workers on the same side of an equation. And now that we don't have a peasantry so much in the developed world, but we do have still rural agrarian workers. And there's still tensions there, so we do have to deal with that. And part of that, I think, is through urban agriculture, and part of that's through actually really trying to deal with the needs of rural workers, so that they are not incentivized to go with the petite bourgeoisie and be all reactionary, which is what's going to happen otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think socialists historically haven't been great at that. And to give the PRC its due, for all that I can say about stuff that I may disagree with different periods of and we have to periodize Chinese history anyway. Like modern PRC has very many distinct periods, and I think we tend to like pretend that it's like Mao, Deng.
And actually, like, multiple currents within the party that really are in contrast with each other.
And are very hard to understand if you don't read and speak Mandarin. And I only know that not because I read and speak Mandarin, I don't, because I know people who do.
Me too. I'm like sponging off of others.
I know I know a good bit of Korean, but
great.
Although it was funny because when I was trying to learn more about the DPRK, talk about having ambivalent feelings about something, but when I was actually the place where my Korean skills were good enough to do it, I could not access anything. Because South Korea censors the shit out of its internet and book systems, etc. So
I wouldn't have known that. I have some friends were in Nodut Dol, and I don't know if you know that organization, and so I learned from them about a whole bunch of things that I was so completely ignorant about. But I didn't know that. But what you're actually adding as well to that, because I didn't know the extent of it. Wow. Even knowing Korean.
Yeah, getting like English language, like North Korean news out of Russia in English, which you can pretty much easily get in the US. Normally you can't get in South Korea. It's just it's the two things that they really censor is porn and news about the North. Like it's definitely a thing. And I used to tell people this, weirdly, the Republic of Korea was the only place where I lived where it was technically illegal for me to be a Marxist. They never the national security law is still in play. They don't deport people for it anymore, but usually they have. I think twice, but usually it's not, they don't invoke it. It's like, but it's this sort of Damocles just hanging around. If you as a foreigner get too involved in local politics. So again, free world. Like it's
it's free for some.
And honestly, as a English speaking American, I had a lot more leeway than, say, if you are, say, a Filipino worker, which there are quite a few of, or a Bangladeshi, worker who's come over from one of the Korean-owned, the chaebol-owned factories in Bangladesh, because what people don't understand about South Korea's developmental model is it decided when in the 70s, when Nixon placed all those restrictions on its textile imports, it decided to go to Southeast Asia and do what the U.S. had done to it. So the chaebols went and established factories in Bangladesh to get around the import restrictions, but then also realized they could leverage that as a way to increase local capital. The imperialized in the imperialist world learn from the imperialist and then do it elsewhere. Like, you know.
What a clever bunch.
Yeah, it's a very I mean, you know, I guess game recognized game, but it's a pretty living in that part of the world and learning its history was very eye-opening. Also eye-opening to planning, because even the even Sigmund Rhee, the anti-communist, based his developmental program off of the Soviet developmental program. Like it was it like explicitly. So it's like,
and Sigmund Rhee was one of the most vicious characters I've ever read about.
He was a nasty. Yeah. And Park, his successor, was also nasty. Also had 5-year programs. It was, it was very similar to Singapore. There is this way. Right. Yeah, there is this way in which the capitalist world in East Asia learned a lot of things from the Soviets, but then used them to fight communism. Like it's a very again, I never hear Western leftists talk about this, just like oh yeah, like, so it was so messed up that the East Asian developmental model was based off of it or off of fascism. Those are your two options. Like,
exactly.
No one does. I mean, I guess people who the one country that did what they were told to do was India, and look how well that worked out for them.
It's horrific. I mean, it's painful. Yeah, with India. Oh man.
Yeah, I mean, when even Amartya Sen is like, yeah, maybe Mao had a point. You know, there's
that's right. Absolutely.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time. Have a great evening.
You too. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.